Muted.
Okay, there we go. So we are recording this, so if you'd like to review the recording, or if you have a colleague that you was sort of interested but couldn't sit in this afternoon, do let us know. We can get you a link to that. We usually post those for 30 days after each webinar. So as I said, we're going to hop over into LP360, but before I do that, there are two modes that you can run LP360 in. LP360 was originally developed as an add-in for ArcGIS, and that's still a way a lot of our users work with the software, but it will also run basically as a standalone Windows application, and that's actually what I'm going to run in for most of the afternoon here. So with that, let's actually hop over and start looking at the software. So just for the ArcGIS version, because there are a few little GUI differences, I'm going to point those out. So I'm in Arc here, and then I'll close out, and we'll actually go into the standalone version and spend the rest of our time in there. So if you are running in Arc, and I'm running in Arc 10.4 right now, one of the things that you will have to do when you get your evaluation license or when you get your purchase license, LP360 is an extension, so you just have to go to Customize Extensions and make sure, once you've done the install, of course, that LP360 is an enabled extension for you. When you do that, if you look at your available toolbars, right-click in the toolbar area, you'll see there's a variety of LP360 toolbars in here. These are the same toolbars we'll see in the standalone version. You'll just need to turn them on, of course, in your ARC session. And then the only other difference I want to point out right now, for those of you that are going to be working with LP360 in ARC, when you enable the LP360 toolbar, you'll see there's this little Add LiDAR Data Layer button. And if I click that, bring that up, I'll get this little import dialog, and it will allow me to pull in LAS files or LiDAR files. Other types of data that you want to add to your map, rasters, vector information, you're still going to use the standard Add Data button in ARC. You'll see in a minute when we look at this in the standalone version, we actually integrate all of this into the single Add Data button in the standalone version. So that's one just subtle GUI difference to be aware of if you're running in ARC. The other thing to notice in the ARC version is when you do enable LP360, it'll add tabs here in your table of contents, LAS files, point cloud tasks, and then some options. These are similar to tabs we'll see in the standalone version. This is where they show up in ARC. So with that, I'll actually hop over and just open up a standalone LP360 session. So here we have the LP360 GUI. Table of contents over here, blank map. We obviously haven't added anything to it, so nothing showing up in my map view. And of course, as with any engineering or mapping type software, lots and lots of toolbars and buttons. Can be a little bit overwhelming, of course, for a new user, but don't worry too much about that. We'll focus on the key ones you need to get started, pulling in some of your data and starting to look at some of your data in LP360. Right-click in the, look in the view, and you'll see I have all of the same different toolbars in here. We're not going to cover all of these today, obviously, don't have the time for that, but we'll focus on the key ones for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's just go pull some LiDAR data into our map and start looking at the different ways that you can look at that in LP360. So I have Add LAS Raster Feature Layers. I'm going to go ahead and pop that button up, and that'll bring up this dialog here. So similar to what we saw in the ARC version, but now I can directly add my LAS, my rasters, and my feature layers in here. To LAS, if you're very new to LiDAR, the .las format is the standard exchange format for LiDAR data. It's the ASPRS standard data exchange format for point cloud data, actually, whether it's LiDAR or some other sensor source out there. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about LAS. And if I want to go ahead and pull in some data, it's just a matter of saying, okay, I want to add some data here, browse out, wherever that data is on your system. We're going to be using Davidson County. It's a very common data set we use in our training, in our webinars. So if you've sat in on any of our webinars, you've probably seen this data set before. And all I have out here, this might have been a deliverable from a vendor or from my own internal groups that have delivered this data. I've just got a folder that has all of my LAS files in it. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab those. This is tiled LAS data, so it's actually going to load them up as tiles. I'll just go ahead and click open here. And we get a lot of information. So when we go to read in these LAS tiles, these LAS files, those files have a header. That header has certain information that can be of interest to you, and it can certainly be of interest if you're QA/QCing data and that kind of thing. All sorts of information, some more obscure than others, but things like, what's the coordinate system that's assigned, how many points are in the file, what version of LAS, because there are different versions, is in there, what the timestamp is, and then on down into more and more metadata about the file. If you don't really want to see all of this, there's a little toggle here. So this is the more brief version that you typically start with, or you can expand it, and this is usually typically good enough for what we want to do when we're just starting to work with the data. So if you look at the lower section here, you see I've got a little bit of information. For instance, it's told me total number of points, total size of all the data I want to read in. It's about 11 gigabytes. Total number of files is up here. But down here, I have a couple of options whenever I'm loading LAS into my map. I can just open it just to read, or I can open it so I can edit it. I can load the files into my session, or I could just load the footprints of the files, the tile footprints, or whatever the geometry was that I was loading in. And then I have some options here about appending to different layers and pyramiding data and so forth. Don't worry too much about those initially when you're starting to work with the data. You just want to always have append to compatible layers and pyramid turned on. Pyramiding, I just want to take a second to talk a little bit about pyramiding, because I'll come back to this when we have the data in the map. So one of the things to be aware of for LP360, the way that LP360 works with LiDAR data or with LAS data, especially large data sets, is it creates pyramid files, essentially like image overviews of the data. And that's how it can work with such large data sets. It basically will decimate the data based at the zoom level that you're looking at your map at and display what's relevant to you. So you can load gigs and gigs of data, and then as you zoom in and out, it's going to determine how much you're actually seeing of that percentage. So the term there is pyramiding. And so the first time you load a LAS file, you'll actually see it creating that pyramid. And those pyramid files, the extension for those is qvr.qvr. So it's actually, I'm telling it pyramid any of these files that need pyramiding. So I'll go ahead and click OK, and it will go ahead and load my data up. Again, if you've got a large data set and you haven't pyramided it before, it may take a little bit longer to load it up. You'll see down in the lower left corner, you'll see a status thing that says reading in file 1 of 10 or 1 of 20 as it goes through and builds the pyramid. For really large data sets, if you're working with like statewide data sets or very large, say, mobile LiDAR data sets, we do have a batch process as a command line utility that comes with LP360 to let you run that initial pyramiding offline remotely through a batch process just to speed things up a little bit. So there we go. So we've got our LiDAR data in our map. A couple of things have happened. We've created our first layer. It's a LAS layer in our table of contents. If I come down here, you can see there's various tabs down here. We'll look at this next one over, which is the LAS files tab. And you can see I've got a list of all of those LAS files that I read in, along with some icons. And these icons are standard, of course, and relatively easy to understand once you know what they are. The first one, the little pyramid, is saying, is that pyramiding done? Is there a valid pyramid file for this LAS file? And if there isn't, the little pyramid symbol will be red. Is the data open and loaded? The little cylindrical canister symbol will be empty if it's not loaded. The padlock, has it been open for editing? If it's just open for read, then the padlock will be red, of course, and then actually the file name in there. So those are all in there as that. And we'll come back to this in a little bit because there's some interesting information we can look at. But I want to just go back and let's look at different ways of looking at our LiDAR data and our point data. Before I do that, one of the things that you can do, so these layers are all, you can customize these, you can name these. Just click in there to go in and give it a more practical name, especially if you're going to be working with different data sets on different layers and stuff. It's good to help keep things organized. So let's talk about viewing our data. What are we looking at here? Well, this is color-coded, and the color coding that gets applied to what we're viewing in the map view can be adjusted a couple of different ways. This is the standard sort of elevation view. We're also, where blue is low, red is high, it's kind of showing us the topography of the area. This is also displaying as points. And you can kind of see that if I zoom in. The map controls are very standard map controls if you're used to working with ARC or any kind of mapping package. I'm just using left and right clicks to zoom in and out and scroll button and so forth. There are the actual tools that you can use over here if you want to switch. I can switch to a pan tool and just pan around in the data if I want to do that. So as I zoom in, we get more and more points being displayed. This is the pyramiding I was talking about, and we can always actually check that. If you look up here, it will tell us in the current map view how many points are being displayed and what percentage of the total points in that area is, basically what level of decimation is being used there. And so you can just see that this number will just keep, the percentage will just keep increasing as we zoom in, and we get more and more points displaying. We're up to 100% now. So now we're seeing everything in our map and in our scene. So the color coding and the point displays are controlled by a couple of buttons up here. And I want to go through these because it's very helpful to know the different ways that you can look at the data. So this button here is the draw display control. So there are a couple of different ways that you can actually draw the data in the map. So currently we're displaying by points. I click the little drop down button, you can see that I've actually got 5 different options. Here's the points one. The next one over is the one I prefer when I'm looking at the map view, and that's to actually draw a shaded surface. So now I've essentially tinned to the data, created a surface from that point cloud data, and that's what I'm displaying in my map view. The other options here include displaying the points on top of the tin, so you can see the tin and the points at the same time, displaying a wireframe, which is useful if you're really zooming right in and you're really getting into looking at terrain relief and looking at the real details of the surface model that you've got. It's a very, very close, detailed view of what's going on. Very useful in QA/QC procedures and other times when you're really trying to get in what's going on with your data. And then the last one would be points on top of a tin. But I'll just go back to the surface because, as I said, that tends to be the one that I prefer looking at in the map view. Now, as I mentioned, this is elevation coded. So this is, red is high, blue is low. It's kind of showing us the topography of the area and some of the structure. And, as you zoom in and out, you'll get more and more of those details popping up for you. For instance, I can see that we've got a bit of this is an airport out here, so those are the runways. This button here, so here's where I changed the points and tin and so forth. This button here, this one right here, determines what kind of color coding, what kind of theme we want to apply to the data. So, as I mentioned, this is by elevation. You can use something, elevation bands. It's rather psychedelic in my mind, where you're just basically using fixed bands to show the different elevation. Again, not something I use a lot, but that option is there. The more commonly used all the time is, of course, to display by class or by feature code. So as you're probably aware, these point clouds can be classified. They can have a ground surface extracted. They can have buildings identified. They can have different levels of vegetation, low, medium, high vegetation identified. They can have water bodies identified. And those are typically displayed or differentiated in the map view by color coding them. And that's what we're looking at here. The sort of browny orange color, that's my ground class, that's my ground surface. The blue is water bodies, that's points that have been classified as belonging to a water body. And then the gray points are essentially unclassified or above ground features. So there was a ground classification and water bodies done on this data, but no above ground features. And you can see that. I'm going to zoom in. I said this is Davidson County, so it's essentially Nashville. This is downtown Nashville over here with the football stadium and the bridges and so forth. So you can kind of see, yeah, the grays are the buildings that have not been classified, and noise and clutter. So there's been no above ground noise filtering done either. So that's why you see this kind of little clutter that's picking up in there. Now, one of the nice things about having classified data, of course, is that you can then control what you want to view, what you want to display in your map view. So you basically can turn classes on and off. And the way that you're going to do that in LP360 is through filters. So I'm looking at this section over here where it says filters. And if I look at a little drop down, now when you first install, if it's a clean install, you probably only have canopy and ground in here. These are other ones or other filters that I've created. You can create your own personal filters and save those as well. And probably the best way to work with these filters is through using what we call live view. So that's the little yellow funnel icon that you see right here. And I'm going to go ahead and click that. And that will pop up another window. Sometimes this window will start minimized, so if you don't see it in your setup, you know, check down elsewhere on your screen. It may be minimized on your screen. And this live view window can stay up. You can have it on your second monitor, and it's interactive. It'll update as you make changes in live view. That will update what you're seeing in the map view. And what I'm looking at here is these are just all of my different classes. You can see they've got a standard class table. The ASPRS standard defines particular classes for the labs file. So, you know, class 2 is ground, class 1 is unclassified, on up into some other less common classes up here. And I can use this to turn different layers on and off. So for instance, if I wanted to look at my map, but I want to turn off all of my unclassified, my gray points, I can just click on this, and that will turn off all my unclassified points. So now I'm just looking at my bare earth surface, my water body over here, and I have these purple points that I see popping up here. And if I go back to my live view, you see that those are low points or noise points. So I could turn those off as well just by clicking on there. I still have a few on, so that those may be in a different class. Now if I zoom back out, so now I'm essentially looking at this area of interest I have in Davidson County and essentially the terrain model for that area, along with the water bodies that have been identified. So live view is a great way to do this kind of filtering. If you've got a particular set of classes that you want on or off, then you can come up here, you can hit this little save button. You can give that filter a name, or you can rename an existing one or update an existing one. So for instance, if I go back, I've got a couple of custom ones here. If I go to, say, this one, it's like Davidson base classes. These are just all of the base classes that are in my data, and it's gone ahead and turned those on. So you can save those filters for your own use as you find what's appropriate for your application. So that's viewing by a class or feature code. You can also view by intensity, assuming that your your LiDAR data, your point cloud has intensity values, which the vast majority of data sets would these days. If you've got particularly old data sets, or you're working with point clouds from other types of sensors like drones, you may not have that intensity value, but most current data sets will. And intensity is just, what it sounds like. It's basically the signal strength, the return, the laser return. It's measuring the strength of that signal and referring that to intensity. It's not necessarily the absolutely correct use of the intensity. It's more like an amplitude, but the main idea is you get basically a black and white, almost grayscale view of your data, where the more reflective surfaces, remember that you're probably working with a sensor that's working in the infrared, show up as bright white objects, and the less reflective surfaces show up as the darker objects. But it's a way to give you context about what it is you're looking at. You can visually start to distinguish things in your point cloud that you can't tell from other features. So this intensity view is useful. You can also combine these. If I go back to my elevation, display by elevation, so you see here I've got kind of a pretty flat surface. There's not a lot of detail there that I can pick up visually. But this button in the middle here that's between the display type and the draw type will allow you to essentially apply the intensity, basically modulate what you're looking at in the map view by the intensity. So basically shade it by the intensity. So it's kind of a combined. So now I've got elevation and intensity displayed together. And you can see that's another helpful way to start to be able to visually identify features in my data set. And of course that will apply too if I switch back to my surface model. Okay. So the main thing is once you have your LiDAR data in, it's these buttons up here, the display type and the draw type, along with intensity shading, that can be really effective for you. And I encourage you, as you start your evaluation or you're first starting to work with the software, to spend some time looking at these different ones and trying to get comfortable with the idea of the different ways that you can look at the data. The other option that you have here is you can turn contours on. So you can display contours in your map view. If you look at the little drop down, there's actually two types of contours, display contours and display smoothed contours. So we can do a little bit of smoothing on the contour draw. Now you can see that I'm contouring everything. I don't have just my ground surface on, so of course I've got all this clutter in here because I'm actually contouring up through my canopy. If I wanted to go back, I can filter back down to my ground class and clean that up. So another really nice aspect of having this rich classified data is very quickly, very easily to essentially clear cut your vegetation or your features and just be looking at your ground model. Now if you want to play around with these the display of these contours, if you control left click on the contour button, it'll bring up contour properties. So all I did was control left click on here, and so you can see I can set what my particular interval is. So I can do a user specified interval. So I might up this to 5 map units. We're in meters down here. I can tell that from down here. I can also change, if I don't like the pink, I can thicken these up and make these guys yellow. So you can play around with these and apply those. So now I'm looking at 5 meter contours and so on. So you can do that. But I'll turn those off for now. So let's zoom out a little bit here. And we'll stay looking at the airport. I'll turn off the intensity for now, so we'll just look at the surface model, and I'll go back to all points in my data. So this is the map view. Obviously, it's very important. It's a top-down 2D, planimetric view of your data. Very common way to look at your data. But there are other ways that we can look at the data, that we commonly want to be able to view our point cloud so that we can make assessments or do analysis on the point cloud. So the most common of these, of course, is a profile or a cross-section, a cut through the data so that we can see the vertical distribution of the points. And so if you bring up the, I believe it's this one, the Viewer Integration Toolbar. It's already on. Yeah, it's this one right here. These toolbars are standard toolbars, so I can drag and drop them and put them where they want. I'll move it out here so we kind of see this. Again, lots of new buttons and stuff. Don't worry too much about it. There's a couple on here I want you to focus on and learn pretty quickly. So this button in, this second one in, sorry about that. The second one in is the Draw Profile button. So if I click on this, okay, it'll allow me to draw a profile line, and then it'll bring up a profile window, and we can look at our cross-section. So I click on that, and then the routine is very simple. You get very comfortable with it very quickly. It's the left click of the mouse to start my line. You can kind of see my line there, wherever I might want to draw my profile. A left click to end my line. And now as I move my mouse, it's setting the width, and essentially the depth of my profile, how thick a cross-section I want to cut. So if I'm just looking at this area on this building, when I've got the depth, I can just left click, and it'll pop up this profile window down here. I'll expand that so we can look at this. This window can be floated off as well. You can drag it onto a second monitor. You can do all sorts of things with that as well. But we'll just look at it here. So what I'm looking at here now, so now my vertical axis is my elevation, and my horizontal axis is the distance along my cut or my profile. And if you actually look, I don't know how well it'll show up over the web, but if you look at the profile up here in the map view, you'll actually see when I have my mouse in the profile window, as I move my mouse back and forth, I can see actually where the mouse is in the profile, that little perpendicular cut that's going across there. So this is a very useful way to look at your LiDAR data. We can see our ground surface, we can see our vegetation in here, we can see this building roof, it's a nice flat building out here. All of the display types that I mentioned when we're looking at the map view, they're available here as well. So we're looking at elevation, but I could just as easily look at classification. I can filter these the same way as I was filtering the map view. I could look at just my ground class. So now I've got a cross-section or cut that just looks at my ground. It's a very helpful, very effective way to do it. The graticule here is set up so you can make measurements. There's a little measure tool right here. If you wanted to measure the height of that building, we could do that. If I want to change the thickness of my profile, I can modify the profile depth here. If I wanted to make this a little bit thinner, I can enter a value here and thin it up a little. Because if you make your profiles too thick, it tends to get cluttered. You're not really visually going to be distinguishing what it is that you're looking at. And there's a variety of tools in here for doing things like draping a profile line, exporting that profile line, and so forth. I will mention there is online help available, so you can come up here into help and go look in the LP360 help system. I really encourage you to use this as a learning tool for your evaluation or when you're first starting to use the software. So for instance, type in here and I can get different types of things. If I want, here's something interesting, if I want to change the vertical scale in the profile window, right? So basically add some vertical exaggeration. It tells you right here, use Control plus mouse wheel, and that will let you change the scale. So I can come in here, I can Control plus mouse wheel, and you can see I can basically apply some exaggeration. So the help is a great self-learning tool, so I definitely encourage you to use that. as you're first starting to work with the software. So I've got about 1.5 exaggeration there. So profiles are very powerful. You use them a lot, depending on your particular application for looking at your data. But there's a third way to view the data, which we want to look at, and that's essentially what we call the 3D view. So I go back to my viewer integration toolbar. So this was the profile view, draw a profile line. This one right here, the fifth one along, is draw the 3D viewer. So if I click on this one, what I'm going to do is left click and hold, and you can see I'm dragging a polygon basically, and this is going to define the extent of my map view that I'm going to draw in my 3D viewer, and it's going to open that window for me. So I'll just drop it around that building we're looking at, and it'll pop up this 3D viewer window. And again, these windows are independent. You can drag them off, float them, move them over onto your second monitor, move them around as you would expect with any kind of mapping software. So this view is a 3D view. So essentially I'm going to left click and hold the mouse button, and I can zoom in. Let's see that. I can right click and hold, and so I can rotate. I can flip it upside down if I want to. And if I click and hold both buttons, I can pan it around in the 3D view. So a very nice way to be able to go in and look at your data. The control mouse wheel works as well for applying some exaggeration, and that can be something that can be quite helpful in these kind of views, because I find it helpful for me to visually to be able to get a better sense, especially when you have fairly flat topography, as we kind of do here. And you have available all of the different display and draw types in there. I can draw this as a tin. I can draw this as an intensity shaded tin. These are all independent, so you have different views in each window if you want. Okay, so just pause if there's any questions. Do please type them into the question box there, and we'll take a look at those. Let me just see here. Okay. Yeah. So, one question about the display. I mentioned for the map view, you're going to get a certain level of decimation that's shown here. That same decimation level will be applied to the 3D view. Should you ever want to force 100% view, so this is what someone's asking, can you make sure that you're looking at all of the data? There is a toggle here which basically says go ahead and, what's my tooltip? There we go, force 100% resolution. What that will force LP360 to do is try to load up the entire scene into your memory. Depending on the available memory, you may hit an overflow condition. It just won't be able to load everything up. It's a benign stop. It'll just tell you, okay, I hit an overflow. It's not going to crash the software or anything like that. The profile view is different. Profile view always displays in 100%. So there's no decimation. There's no force 100% option down here. Profile is always displaying at 100%. Let me move on, because there's a few other things that I want to show you. And I'll mention this again at the end. We understand you're evaluating the software. You're first starting to learn the software. As I mentioned, the online help is a great way to work with that. If you are running into issues or you're banging your head against the wall, you really can't figure out something, by all means, let us know. We want you to be comfortable learning the software and using the software during your evaluation as effectively as possible. I will mention a couple of things fairly quickly. I'm going to go look at the LAS files tab. And I mentioned there's various things that we can do here with these LAS files. If I select a file here and then right-click, you can see that I can load and unload individual files. I can open files for read-write, do various kind of options here. one thing that can be helpful, primarily from perhaps a QA/QC, or if you're someone that's responsible for looking at things like what's the information that's in the LAS file header, you can actually pull that up for the file. And this is where you can get into some of that same information we saw when we imported the data. If you're not familiar with working with LAS files or LAS file headers, a lot of this information is not going to be particularly helpful for you. But as you learn a little bit more about the data, as you start to understand the way the files are put together, you'll understand it's fairly important information, especially if you need to troubleshoot or quality check some data. Again, it's things like what's the version, how many returns are there, number of points per return, and some other metrics and data about that. So you can look at that for individual files. You can also collect that, run a statistics task. I'll talk about point cloud tasks in a minute, but you can also run a statistics task, that'll extract a lot of that information for your whole data collection and set that up as an attribute table in a shapefile for you. So you don't have to go, if you've got, I've got 117 files here, I don't have to go in and individually select each one to go look at the file header. There is a way to just do a batch report or output from that. Okay. So let me, I'm going to turn off the Profile 3D windows for now. We'll go back to our full data set. Zoom out here. We brought in some LAS data. If you have imagery for your project that you want to bring into your map, you can do that as well. Again, if you were in ArcGIS, you'd use the standard add data to pull that raster in. If you're running standalone like me, we can just come out here. There's a raster tab. It's exactly the same routine. I'll just go out, say I want to add a raster. Here's my image here. I can go grab an image. Assuming it's a standard format that it understands, everything should be fine. I can say, okay, go ahead, let's pull that in. You can turn layers on and off here as you normally would expect. So now I've got my background ortho image of my project area. Downtown Nashville over here, the airport out here. You can also add, right beside the add LAS raster feature layers, you can also add a WMS layer. This can be some public WMS, so like for Bing, Google, some of the USGS stuff that's available there, or you can point this to, there's a WMS manager that lets you point to an internal WMS map server if you have one. If I wanted to put in Bing Aerial, I could go ahead and do that. If I don't have ortho imagery, then that can be quite nice, because now I've got my Bing backdrop for my map. Okay. So you can pull your LiDAR data in. Hopefully you understand. It's pretty straightforward. Just import your LAS data. You may see it making those pyramid files, as I said, and then you have all of these valuable ways to look at the data by elevation and class and so forth. You look at profile views, look at 3D views. That's nice for viewing the data and for doing some analytics where you just want to look at the data, but what about actually manipulating or working with the point data? Specifically, we're going to talk about classifying data here, or feature coding the data, because that's often something that people want to do or customize for their data set. If you've got fully classified data from your vendor or from your data warehouse, then that's great. But often people will want to look at different ways of modifying or updating classification of the point data. So I'm going to talk about two different ways that you can do this in LP360. We have some manual tools that let you manually reclassify data. And then I'll talk a little bit about our point cloud tasks, which are more automated or scripted ways of working with the point data. So I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to go back to downtown Nashville. It's kind of a nice area to work with. So we'll zoom back in here. Okay, and I'm going to go switch back to my classification view. So I can see that I've got unclassified data. I can see the building roofs, of course, here, and these are actually cars in the parking lot and so forth. But if I drop a profile, here's my profile tool again. If I drop a profile across one of these buildings, switch my profile out so it covers the building, I can see I've got a lot of unclassified data there. You'll also notice when I look at it in profile, I can see that I'm also getting returns from the side of the buildings, which is not unusual. This was an airborne data collect. You are going to get some returns from sides of buildings and so forth. If I wanted to go ahead and manually classify these building roofs, not something that you would really do a large number of buildings with, because it's very time consuming, very labor intensive, but if I wanted to do something like that, there are a couple of ways that I can do it. The manual classification or the manual editing tools in LP360, there's two main areas where you can apply them. In the profile window, there are these set of tools here, and we'll look at those first. And in the map view, it's a very similar looking toolbar up here, and we'll look at those second. And these are actually the LP360 classify toolbar that's in here. So the way that you set yourself up to do some manual editing of the points is kind of left to right along the different tools. The first one, it's a bit of a subtlety whether or not you're going to classify points that aren't visible in your view. You may have a certain class turned off, but you still want to reclassify it. This is just a toggle. You can toggle it on or off. The second button here, the one that says modify the source selection filter, is very important. So basically when you're doing a manual edit or when you're reclassifying point cloud data, you're basically doing a from to. You're saying move things from this class to this class. So that from selection, that source, we can filter that. Okay, so if I click on that button, I can get a little selection filter. And again, lots of tabs here. Don't worry too much about most of them. The main one I'm looking at here is these different classes. If I look at my data, I can say, you know, my ground class is good. I think my ground class is very valid. I don't want to mistakenly reclassify any of the ground class or any other classes actually that may be in the data, like the water bodies or anything like that. I just want to reclassify unclassified points in class 1 that haven't been assigned a feature code. So I could turn off all my classes except unclassified. So now I'm only my from class is only going to be unclassified. Then there's a couple of buttons here that kind of indicate how you're going to reclassify the data. I'll come back to these. And then at the end here, you'll see the destination class and flags, and what do you want to set for these. So again, it's a from to. What do I want to move my unclassified points to? I want to move them into my building class. Don't worry about flags. That's things like withheld and overlap related to that LAS file format. Again, if you have questions about that, we're more than happy to answer them, but we don't need to worry about it for just evaluating the software or your first few sessions using it. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going from unclassified to building. And then the tools that I have here are some very standard ones. So I can do it above a line, I can do below a line, I can draw a polygon, I can use a paintbrush. I'll do the classic one, which is above a line. So I'll turn that on, a little reminder that I'm about to start editing the points. And so now what I can do is I can come into my profile view. I can essentially just draw a line along here, and you'll see that the points are starting to, it's highlighting the points in white. When I'm finished, I can just hit spacebar, and that'll apply my to or my reclassification. So there we go. So now I've got that building roof nicely classified. Of course, if you pay attention to detail, you realize there's a lot of structure on the roof. There might be air conditioning units and up here, so you do need to be a little bit careful about that kind of stuff. So very straightforward, very simple way to do that. A second way to do that, we can do the same kind of from to manual editing of point data in the map view. Same tools here. I won't worry about the hidden points. Same thing. It's a different source filter because I may want to classify differently in my map view from my profile view, but I'll keep it the same. I'm just going to classify my unclassified. I don't want to reclassify anything else. My destination class is going to be buildings, so I'm doing building roofs. And now I've got things like, again, paintbrushes of different sizes, circular or square paintbrushes, or even just draw a polygon. So I'll use the draw polygon, and now I can come in here, draw a polygon. You can see again it's highlighting in white. And when I'm ready, I just go ahead and commit that change, and there I've got my building roof on that one. Now, of course, I'd need to do a little bit of cleanup because I'm not being particularly careful about how I'm doing it. But so you have these manual editing tools, these interactive tools that let you clean up and classify data. That can be useful if you're working with a small area of your data set, or you just have a little bit of editing to do, or you're working on a small site, something like that. It's, of course, quite labor intensive. So there are ways to do other kinds of classifications more automated, and what we use for that is what we call point cloud tasks. Okay, so I've got I'm going to go to my point cloud tasks tab down here, and when you first start your evaluation, or when you first do a clean install of LP360, if you come to your point clouds task and you look at your this is essentially your library. It'll look a little different from this. When you look at the drop down, you won't have any of all these numbered ones in here. That's my own personal library I've built up over the years of using it. What you'll typically see is what you kind of see here at the bottom. There'll be a list of a few of these defaulted, and a very short list at that. So you actually will want to start building up your own library. And the way that that's done, if you click in here, say I want to add a point cloud task, you'll be able to get to a drop down of all the out-of-the-box tasks, or these are essentially scripts or algorithms that you can run on the data that are available to you, and you'll be able to start building a library of these classification tasks. Again, a lot of different point cloud tasks here. Certainly don't have time to go through all of these. We're just going to pick one which may be of interest to us, and this is a height filter. So this is like a height segmentation filter. And it's a good example to show you kind of how these tasks work. I'll just give it a name. So we can do that. So now we've got a new task in our library, and each task has a little bit different dialogue here, so you'll see that these are different. This is a very simple height segmentation. Basically, if you have a ground surface, you can classify things based on how high above that ground surface they are. Again, we've got a source points filter, just exactly like when we're manually editing. We want to make sure that we don't unclassify or reclassify things that we don't want to change the classification of. So I'll say, well, yeah, just unclassified. I just want to look at my unclassified points. It needs to know where the ground points are, or more strictly speaking, where the surface is. It's going to do the height segmentation above. That's almost always class 2 ground points in any kind of standard LAS file. And now I can set I can add a range in here. So again, this is a height segmentation, so we're looking vertically above the ground. And these are tall buildings. We're in downtown Nashville, so let's be fairly generous. We'll say anything that's over 10 meters tall up to 100 meters tall. Oops. I'll say up to 1,000 meters tall. Certainly nothing that big. That's what we're going to want to apply this to. And we want to move this to a building class. Again, don't worry about flags. That's a little bit more related to the LAS files. So go ahead and click OK. So now we've got a height segmentation that'll move anything between 10 to a kilometer above the ground into our building class. I'll go ahead and click Apply down here. point cloud tasks are executed a little bit differently. I need to bring up my point cloud task toolbar. It's actually already open, so I'll just toggle it off and back on. Pretty sure it was, yeah, so it's over here. And there's a variety of different ways that you can execute these point cloud tasks depending on the way that the task was set up, by a mouse click or just by giving it a point, by providing a line, or by drawing polygons or rectangles or circles, that kind of standard kind of stuff. You can also execute this against an entire project. So you can run this, I could run this height segmentation against all 117 files at once just by clicking the Run Against the Project button. Won't do that. We don't have time for that. You can also run against feature layers. So, for example, if I had building footprints of downtown Nashville and I brought those in, remember you can bring in reference layers as well, feature layers as well, I could just give that as an input and say, here's all my building footprints. Go classify all the points inside those building footprints based on this height segmentation and so forth. Just for purposes of demonstration, I'm just going to do a quick draw polygon around some buildings. So we'll do it over here. So really with a point cloud task, you generally would be running on much larger parts of your data because, I mean, I could just as easily do this manually, of course, but it's just for the purposes of the demonstration. So whenever you run a point cloud task, it's going to, it actually ran really quickly, but there was a little status down here that said, processing task and so on and so forth. And so I've gone ahead and then classified out the roofs in that block of downtown Nashville for anything that was over 10 meters tall. So obviously these buildings are lower than 10 meters, less than 30 feet. But hopefully that gives you a sense of, the point cloud tasks are the way that you start to do more automated batch processing or batch classification of the data. It does take a bit of time to get to learn and understand these. So, if you're doing an evaluation, it's not something that you necessarily will be able to pick up right away. By all means, I encourage you to use them and look at them. Use the online help to start to understand what they are. If you're interested in ground, there is a ground filter that can be run. You could do classify by features. You can conflate. If you've got some existing geometries and vectors, you can drape that to your LiDAR data. There's a lot of really nice value-added things that you can do with these point cloud tasks. So I do encourage you to play around with this, but they are something that does take a little bit of time and obviously having some more formal training on to really start to become comfortable and become an expert with. But by all means, in your evaluation, I definitely encourage you to play around with those. Okay, so there's one more thing I want to show you, and then we'll wrap up as we're coming up to the top of the hour. And we do have a question. I'll get to your question in a second there, person that submitted that. So you can do a lot with your point cloud data. You can bring it into LP360. You can look at it in the different views. You can manually edit and update classifications. You can run the point cloud tasks I was just talking about. At some point, you may actually want to output some of your data. So there is a final button I'll show you here, up here on the main toolbar. This one here called Export LiDAR Data, right beside the force 100%. So this will actually bring up a wizard, an output wizard that you can walk through. We won't bother going through all of the details just for time here, but basically you can export points or you can export a surface. So let's say we were going to do a surface. It's a very common thing. We might want to be actually generating a DTM or a DEM of our ground surface. So I can come in here, I can set some parameters, the type of surface that I want to do, what particular values I want to use, what export format I want to use. If I was just doing this as an ASCII DEM file, that would be fine. So elevation for my digital elevation model. Notice there are full support for break lines as well. We didn't really touch on that, but you can drop break lines into your map and use those when generating surfaces and so forth. The standard source points filter that we've seen many times. So I could say in here, I'm just doing a DTM I just want my terrain model. So I just want my ground glass. You can save these different settings, by the way, because there'll be certain sets that you want to use. What do I actually want to export? I can do the full layer. I could draw a window in the map, all kind of standard common sense kind of things. And then basically just browse out and give it a file name for what I want to export. So there are ways, once you've got your data set where it is, or you've got the area of your project site where it is, that you can then output surfaces, output contours, output DTMs, the DMs, the point cloud. If you just need to segregate the point cloud, you want a smaller LAS file, all sorts of ways that you can push the data out if you need to some downstream work, or as a deliverable to a customer or a client. Okay, so we'll start to wrap it up there because we are coming up to the top of the hour. I apologize, we've gone a little bit over here. You know, as I mentioned, especially if you're doing an evaluation or just first starting to use the software, we really encourage you to play with it. I mean, it's an engineering piece of software. The worst that can happen is you will crash it. You're not going to break anything. So you can really, using that online help guide, really start to learn and understand the basics of how to work with your LAS data, how to work with your LiDAR data or your point cloud data in LP360. There's a lot of other features that we really obviously didn't have time to get into, ways of doing feature editing, ways of doing some more advanced point cloud tasks like automatically extracting stock paltos and these kind of things. Leave those, learn to walk before you run. Get comfortable with the GUI and working with your data. If you do have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. We're more than happy to help you out and make sure that you're getting the most out of your evaluation. So with that, I'm going to go wrap it up. As I say, we were recording the session, so if you'd like to review it, let us know. We'll be able to get you a link for that, or if you had a colleague that couldn't join us that you think might be interested, let us know, and we'll send you that link as well. And any questions, feel free to email us. You can email me, mflood@goq.com. Again, my name is Martin, or just info at LP360.com or support@LP360.com. And Madeline's been in touch with all of you. She'll follow up with you as well for those of you who are looking at purchasing and help you out with that side of it. So with that, we'll close off, and thanks everybody for attending.